this internal monologue about how like, oh no, it's happening again, I'm falling in love with a guy where like, so like number one, the problem is that we're both men, so like I face that discrimination, and then number two, even if I tell him I like him, I'm asexual and he might not accept that and might not want to be with me. But then when it turns out that when he finally tells him and comes out to him, Eka is like totally okay with it. He's just like, well, like you love me and it's okay, even if it's different, which I think like is really powerful, and like something I really like. That kind of issue is something I never expected to see in anything close to mainstream. So yeah, they're really interesting. And then in the side chapter that looks at their domestic life 10 years later, Kanzaki mentions how like, oh yeah, there's also like different kinds of asexuality, and here's just my particular kind where like I can have a libido, it's just not directed at anyone. And then they have to like work out their issues of like, how do we make our relationship work when it's like this? And yeah, really powerful stuff. Also like really interesting to see a specifically like gay and non-binary ace character. So yeah. Unfortunately, this series is like 12 volumes long, and you have to read through like all 12 to get to this stuff. But it's interesting. There's because devils are basically vampires, and kind of like Scum's Wish, it doesn't describe me, doesn't surprise me that this manga in particular would like end up incorporating asexuality in some way, because Devil's Line kind of takes that like stereotypical vampire, like equating bloodlust to a sexual desire into an opportunity to take its like devil and human couples to discuss consent and like what role sex has in their relationship. So it's really interesting to see how that kind of leads to like, okay, but what about these two too, and how does sex work in their relationship? So yeah, interesting stuff. So next we have webcomics by Chi. Has anyone here read or heard of a manga called The Bride Was a Boy? Yeah. Okay, good. It's really good. It's an autobiographical manga by a Japanese trans woman named Chi. And it's the book, which is also available in English, was collected from strips posted on her blog and Twitter account. But the thing is that she has even more strips on her website, and she like uploads new ones weekly about her life, about LGBTQ issues, and more. They're only available in Japanese, unfortunately. So some of her comics guest star her husband and her friends, including her friend known as Asexuality, kind of, so it would be like Ace-kun in English. He often gives like these asexual perspectives on the matter at hand they're discussing, or she illustrates his life to bring attention to asexual issues. She also has a series of strips defining LGBTQ identities, including asexuality. There is a lack of non-sexuality and Japanese aromanticism on the site, as far as I can tell. But that could be because she doesn't have like a close friend in those groups like she does Asexuality to turn to discuss them. And yeah, there's a lot of strips with cultural exchange where Asexuality like teaches her about concepts from English-speaking communities too, like romantic orientation or shorting asexual to ace. I wish I could say maybe this will be available in English someday, but unfortunately these webcomic strips haven't been collected into a printed volume in Japanese to begin with, like The Bride Was a Boy was. But I do hope that, so really I just hope that more of Chi's work will be published in Japanese first, and then maybe an English publisher will pick those up. But in the meantime, you can learn Japanese, or you can buy The Bride Was a Boy in English, and that's a way of supporting an asexual ally, at least. So, yeah. Okay. Last we have Kiryu Sensei Doesn't Understand Love, which was localized as aromantic love story in French. It's not available in English, unfortunately, but it's just this short 5-volume manga about a woman named Kiryu Sensei who works as a mangaka, a manga artist, where she's hired to write a really trashy, like, harem manga. but the thing is that she herself in her personal life has, like, never been in a relationship. She doesn't think she's ever experienced love, so she's like, I don't know how to write this. And especially, she's also very critical of mainstream depictions of girls and romantic relationships and social issues, so she especially, like, doesn't know how to approach this. But in the process, she's also questioning her sexuality, her sexual orientation, and one thing that she is considering is that she could be asexual. And then on top of that, two of her associates in her line of work, one of them is an assistant to the manga creation, and then the other one is, like, a guy working in publishing. I don't remember his job exactly. They both confess that they're in love with her, so then she has to deal with all that too. And I don't want to spoil it per se, but it doesn't really answer anything too definitively. She doesn't come to identify as ace or anything, but it does acknowledge it as a potential, which is good. And then she doesn't really end up with either guy, so there's that. I hope it'll be available in English, since it was already available in French. And the French edition also came with, like, a little book of just, like, guides of, like, definitions for words like aromantic and asexual, which is really interesting. And they also just, like, totally colored it in the ace flag. It's really interesting. I mean, it had to be on purpose. I think it's really neat. So yeah, maybe in English next time. Okay, so that was all the stuff where asexuality is officially brought up, but that couldn't fill a whole panel. So next we're going to talk about characters that could be described as aromantic or asexual. This is kind of where I start to slip into more of the, like, English definitions too, just for the casualty of it. So this is examples where, and I think they're important to bring up even if they're unofficial, because the impressions that people get about asexuality, even if they don't know the name for it, or, like, when they first hear about it, they might, like, think back to, like, fiction they've read or watched. So because there's so little, like, actual asexual representation, that maybe they would think back on one of these characters. So these are characters that can be read as asexual, stories that explore sexuality in a way adjacent to asexuality, etc. The context of the quote I put here is from one of the developers of the Yakuza games, who was basically talking about how he thought of the main character Kiryu as a virgin, even if that, like, may have contradicted canon game materials. Is like that. Well, it's just how I think of him, and I think, like, I don't know, if an official creator can have, like, their own headcanons about a character, like, I think we can too. Yeah. Okay. So when you Google asexual anime characters, or even just ace characters in general, Luffy from One Piece is, like, the big one that comes up, where, especially since One Piece is, like, the most, it's the most popular manga in Japan, and is really popular worldwide too, where, a disclaimer, I haven't read all of One Piece, it's really long. But I am, like, familiar with it, just, like, culturally, where, so the reasonings that people give for why Luffy is asexual is that, like, in context, there's just things where, like, in the context of One Piece, he does not express sexual desire when other characters would, like, even if it's, like, magic powers, like, Boa Hancock's devil fruit power is that, like, it like takes another person's lust and, like, increases it, like, towards her as, like, kind of a way of mind control, from what I understand. I have not read all of it entirely. So So that's why it comes up a lot. And then there's also just like, there's like some contradictory things too that you can point to at the manga, but like it's so long that I think certain scenes speak louder. And I guess I would also say that Luffy is just one of many kind of like shonen manga protagonists that are characterized as really like pure-hearted, which includes that they're like kind of unaware of sexual things and don't really express sexual desire. Where part of that you could, or even like, how to phrase this, where it's hard to say sometimes whether shonen manga is like genuinely trying to like explore platonic relationships because they think they're really important, or because editors think this is for boys don't want to read about romance. So it's really hard to kind of suss out sometimes what exactly it's going for. But overall, I think nonetheless there's like a lot of characters, especially ones that are like older, that aren't like a teenager, that don't react in like a stereotypical sexual way that may like resonate with asexual and aromantic people. So yeah. Okay. So Rei from Sailor Moon, and specifically the manga, because the anime manga, well, the 90s anime have different characterizations. So yeah. So is also another character that comes up a lot if you try to search like asexual anime characters. So in the classic Sailor Moon anime, Rei is really temperamental and she can often be a comedic character. And her fiery personality comes out often in her pursuit of boys, even competing with Usagi for her love interest Mamoru's affection. But in the original manga by Naoko Takeuchi that the show was based on, she's a stoic girl who takes her duty as a shrine maiden really seriously. And that also goes for Sailor Moon Crystal, which is a more direct adaptation of the manga. And another of Rei's defining characteristics in the manga is that she's not interested in dating like the rest of the cast is. Shrine maidens aren't necessarily celibate in real life, but she aspires to care for the shrine without having to marry to support it. And so in the dream arc, the Dead Moon Circus lures Rei into this house of mirrors to force her to give up being a sailor, like a senshi, a warrior for Sailor Moon. And this fake mirror version of herself tells her, like, you can't stay a shrine maiden devoted to your friends forever, you gotta settle down with a man. But then Rei like breaks through that illusion with the help of her pet crows who take human form. I think it's especially interesting how Rei's disinterest in dating and dating men is different from how there are like canonical lesbians in Sailor Moon, of Sailor Neptune and Sailor Uranus, of course. So there's kind of a distinction to be made there, which is really interesting. So she isn't officially asexual or aromantic, but those experiences may resonate with asexual or aromantic readers who feel expected to fall in love or and have sex and have children. But Sailor Moon says that not every person is fulfilled by falling in love or getting married or dating. And in a series about the power of love, I think that's really interesting, that it doesn't only mean romantic love. Rei's power and passion comes from her love of her friends and her family and her pets. So yeah. Okay. Next we have Bloom Into You. I'm more familiar with the manga, but there is also an anime from just recently that's available. I should probably update this slide image from. But so Bloom Into You is a Yuri series about a girl named Yu who has always been like she's always been disinterested in like romantic relationships. She says she's never felt anything that she would consider like love or romantic feelings. And then one day she comes across another girl who is being confessed to, and named Toko, and Toko says, sorry, I'm not gonna go out with you. I've never felt that way. I've never felt love. And Yu thinks like, oh my gosh, she's just like me. I have to like be her friend and get to know her. And then they do become friends. But then shortly after that, Toko suddenly says like, oh, actually, now I'm starting to fall in love with you literally. But and then they start this really fascinating relationship where like they're in agreement that Yu doesn't feel that way, doesn't feel the same way as Toko, but they do like kiss and have this physically intimate relationship on the agreement that that they have different feelings. And in fact, Toko actually says like, oh, I like that you don't feel that way, because then it like puts less pressure on me and everything. But then maybe Yu starts developing feelings, because it's a yuri manga, so it's a romance. But nonetheless, it's like extremely fascinating in its approach to those relationships. And then kind of like other manga I've discussed, then we also have this other side character named Maki, who discovers that they're having a relationship, and then Yu goes to tell him to clarify, like, oh yeah, we're not like a couple though, like, because I've never felt love or anything. And then Maki has kind of the same thought that Yu does at the beginning of the series. It's like, oh my gosh, you're just like me, because I've also never been interested in romance. People, my older sisters tell me about their dating life, and I think it's like interesting and nice, but I've just like never imagined myself doing that. And has a really interesting metaphor of like, oh, it's like watching a play, but I never like want to be an actor in it, which is really interesting. But then Maki kind of looks at the way Yu looks at Toko and is like, oh wait, maybe you're not like me. But nonetheless, I think Maki as a character adds a lot, not only as like a boy in a yuri manga, just to show that like, oh, like there could be boys around that girls aren't interested in, but on top of that, that he is like a genuinely like aromantic, asexual character, because without him it might come across that the story is like, oh, well, you're gonna like grow out of that, and no one could never be in love or whatever. But then by having Maki, it shows that I know some people just are like that. They really don't have any interest, and that'll never change. But with that said, it's like totally fair to read Yu like on like the aromantic or asexual spectrum. I think it's like vague enough, and like nonetheless, it really resonates with a lot of people with those identities. So it's just a really fascinating manga. It's not finished, so it's like kind of hard to talk about definitively in that sense, but definitely recommend it. Okay. So next we have Sunakawa from My Love Story, who I would kind of like how Luffy is meant to be like one example of like the pure-hearted shonen hero. I think Sunakawa is kind of my pick for this archetype that's kind of like the herbivore men I mentioned, where the young men who just aren't really interested in dating, aren't really interested in stuff like that, because Suna's whole thing is that he is he's in a romance shoujo manga, but he is not the protagonist. My Love Story is about like an unlikely couple of like a really huge guy who's never been popular with girls, who suddenly gets a girlfriend who really loves him. And Sunakawa is the best friend of Takio, the main character, and their whole backstory is that all girls love Suna, and they all confess to him, but he says, no, I don't like you like that. I don't want to date anyway. But then the whole thing is that all the girls Takio liked are the ones that would confess to Suna, and Takio was always kind of jealous of that. And then it turns out that Sunakawa rejected all those girls because he knew that they were mean or like disliked Takio. So of course he wouldn't, like, why would I want to date someone who's mean to my best friend? But then as the story goes on and as they like grow into teenagers, it's like there's kind of this mini arc where a girl who's always been in love with Sunakawa and is really nice and gets along with Takio, and his girlfriend Rinko really wants to get to know Sunakawa, and they go on a few dates. He's honestly kind of pity dating her, but I mean, the manga tries to put this really nice spin on it where it's like, oh, it's worth confessing your feelings even if someone like doesn't like you back. It's like worth acknowledging them and everything, but I think it puts Suna in this really awkward position. But I guess my takeaway from it was like, oh, there can be like this perfect girl for Suna, but he still doesn't have to like her back because really he just prefers being friends with Takio, and like as an extension also likes being around Rinko, Takio's girlfriend. So yeah, it's just a nice message to have. Like, you could argue my love story is already kind of like self-aware and deconstructive of like shoujo tropes by its premise, but yeah, I think it's just good to have a character in a rom-com who's just not into dating and might not ever be. So yeah, a very Ace and Arrow kind of adjacent feeling. Okay, so and this is another slide that was contributed by my friend, Angelica, who couldn't be here. And I would kind of argue that, although I am a little familiar with Yusuke, unlike the other examples, where I think Yusuke and Sunakawa kind of fall into that similar territory of like another character who isn't really interested in her, who might be like an attempt at like an herbivore guy character, but I can't totally be sure. But so Yusuke is like one of the main team members in Persona 5, a vital member of the group, and from his first introduction, he's described as incredibly unusual and eccentric. He disregards normal ways of regarding the world, and he just really has a passion for all things artistic. And it's generally highlighted in his disregard for the connection between sexuality and nudity in regards to the human body as aesthetically beautiful. So there's this introduction scene where he demands from the other protagonist to be a nude model for his painting, but he doesn't mean anything sexual by it. He just like thinks she would be beautiful to paint. He just doesn't really have an awareness of like the human form as anything sexual, which is interesting. And that goes for like feminine and masculine body types. And a lot of the other characters will comment on his obliviousness because they just assume he's being a perv, but he's not. That said, kind of like with Sunakawa, it might be like an attempt at a kind of like quirky herbivore character. And Sunakawa and Yusuke and other characters too that kind of fall under this are also interesting because a lot of fans will like interpret them as LGBTQ, whether that's like gay or ace or aromantic, when it kind of becomes complicated when both of these source materials also have kind of like gay stereotype characters. So it's like, because in Persona 5 in particular, there's like a recurring like background characters of like a duo of like gay stereotype guys who are supposed to be really creepy and weird. You're not supposed to like them. It's really bad. But they're meant to be jokes. So it's kind of interesting. Like it's like you can't really say like, oh, well, like Yusuke is obviously queer coded when like you have an example of like more obvious queer coding in those joke characters, but nonetheless, like I think they can really resonate with people and can even be like reclaimed and embraced by them in a nice way. They really could have they could have explained Yusuke's character better and like expanded on more of those ideas. But yeah. Okay. So, and here's another example from my friend. This one I'm less familiar with. This one is Odin Sphere, which is another game by Atlas, also the creators of Persona 5, where they kind of have this entire species of characters that you could describe as asexual aromantic, as like their cultural norm, where Odin Sphere is a story told through 5 playable characters living through the same events from different perspectives. And the first player character, Gwendolyn, is from a race of bird-like warriors who want to colonize the known world. And in that race, the women are considered a lot stronger than the men. And unfortunately, it's a lot less subversive than it sounds. The Valkyries are told within their culture that the only way to earn an ideal afterlife is to die valiantly on the battlefield. Should they survive long enough, they'll be magically put into a deep sleep to awaken at the kiss of their new husband through arranged marriage. So, the coma-inducing spell also includes the effect of forcing the subject to become attracted against their will to their betrothed. So, there's a lot to unpack here, where you have this culture of women who like ideally want to live their lives as warriors and not have like a domestic life, but then if they don't end up doing that, then they're like forced into kind of like date rape marriage, and that's really awkward. And so halfway through the plot, like that happens, like the love potion stuff happens to the main character for political gain of her father, and as soon as she wakes up, like in the arms of her war rivals, she's just like really repulsed by the guy she's been set up with, and so she's like really suffering emotionally, but then despite all that, it's tough to talk about a game that has multiple endings. So it's not like there's a like definitive ending to this character and to this arc, but there is one ending at least where Gwendolyn eventually chooses to live with her assigned husband and fall in love with him, supposedly due to the fact that he's the first person in her life that's ever treated her like a whole person, which like is like that's a nice concept, that's a nice sentiment, but like the context is a lot. And then in the whole game's ending, Gwendolyn becomes the prophesized new mother of all humanity after the world apocalypse. And, like I said, I haven't played this game, so I'm mostly reading off the notes. But for people who like have no desire to like have a romantic partner, and especially like a sexual relationship that would like lead to being a parent like that, is like really, really disappointing to see like a character who's totally okay with it be like forced into it, essentially. So that's not great. So next we have Psycho Mantis for Metal Gear Solid, and like specifically like this particular game, because obviously the series is a lot larger than this, but and this is another one from my friend Angelica contribution. Metal Gear Solid for the PS1 continues the story of Solid Snake from earlier Nintendo Entertainment System games. So you follow Snake on his mission to prevent a major strike against the United States, against Foxhound, a U.S. Black Ops team gone rogue, So Snake attempts to infiltrate Foxhound's hideout and neutralize the threat, and one of the first members of the group that he encounters is a character with telepathic and telekinetic powers named Psycho Mantis. Because also a fun fact, psycho in Japanese just means psychic. It's not kind of like the negative psychotic connotation in English. So that's why that's how it is. So for my friend especially, playing this game as a child, like maybe not a child, but a younger person. So A lot of people remember Psycho Mantis, the encounter with him, for its like fourth wall breaking storytelling in the middle of a somewhat serious game, and its gratuitous emphasis upon his murder intent that is supposedly inspired by past trauma and mental illness. It's really complicated because Psycho Mantis like basically expresses sexual repulsion, sexual aversion. In his defeat speech, where he states his rationale for joining Foxhound's plan to like attack the U.S., Mantis explains that through his lifetime of examining the minds of other people, he essentially became disgusted with humanity's selfish desire to pass on one's seed, basically have sex, and that caused him to follow plans solely for the sake of killing as many people as possible. So, another thing where there's just a lot to unpack there. Yeah, because he's basically a serial killer. And it's another one of those things where it's not like asexuality per se, but like I would definitely call that like sexual repulsion, sexual aversion, to be so disgusted by like thinking about other people have sex that you want to kill people. So it's like, it's really hurtful. I mean, like some people, like there's room for sympathy in the character, definitely, but like for a lot of people it's probably meant to evoke like, wow, that's so weird, like so gross. But yeah, it's just kind of another hurtful example on that note of depicting like an asexual adjacent character. Okay, so we're gonna get a little more positive now after all that, and we're gonna end on the note of basically recommendations for like aro or ace kind of appealing relationships that once again aren't necessarily like canonical, but are really adjacent and may like bring to mind ideas of asexuality and aromanticism. So yeah, I like this quote. What does it mean for two people to connect to each other with emotions that aren't romance? And that quote comes from Okimi Yoshida, who's the creator of Banana Fish, which is an 80s, 90s shoujo manga that recently got an anime, only available on Amazon Prime, unfortunately. And it's about, Banana Fish is about a teenage Japanese boy who travels to New York City for a photography job, photographing teenage gangs in New York City, and there he meets the leader of a gang named Ash Lynx, and together, like, Eiichi and Ash, like, immediately hit it off. They get along and they want to get to know each other, but then they're, like, thrown into all this commotion of, like drugs and gang warfare and, like, military and, like, government corruption and, like, all this conspiracy around a drug called Banana Fish. And as time goes on, they get a lot closer. They both go through a lot and basically only have each other to rely on. And eventually down the line, you do learn that that Ash has a history of being